If you think about how many people would have lived in a house back then, their animals lived with them, it would have been quite a chaotic situation. I just think how different those earliest church quote unquote services would have been with, you've got your cow in the next room, you've got your sheep and your donkey, you've got the baby crying, you're making dinner. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff happening.
Let's just start with the word. So the word church, correct me if I'm wrong, is ecclesia.
Mm-hmm.
That's what is traditionally used in the Gospels to talk about church.
Some Gospels.
Thank you. And so Matthew specifically uses that word, and that's where Matthew 16:18 says, "Now I say to you that you are Peter," which means rock, "and upon this rock I will build my church," ecclesia, "and all the powers of hell will not conquer it." So that's a little kind of weird anyway. How then do you build a church on a person? And was it his teaching? Obviously, I know it's not an actual, well, it is an actual because supposedly St. Peter's Basilica is built on Peter's bones. So they took it very literal.
They did take it very literally, yes.
But what was Jesus actually saying? Just that you're going to be the cornerstone, Peter, that this is going to start with you, whatever. The next is Matthew 18:17, and they're talking about having a disagreement. "If the person still refuses to listen, take your case to the church. Then, if he or she won't accept the church's decision, treat that person as a Gentile or corrupt tax collector." So in that case, the church, ecclesia, was much more of the traditional definition in Greek, which was a gathering of citizens called out of their homes into some public space or an assembly. Almost sounds like an HOA.
Right, it does. I mean, that is what's so interesting to me and what trips me up so much when we look at these words from the Bible that have been translated into English, and the words that we have in English have come to mean a lot of things that I don't think they meant originally when the original books of the Bible were being written. And so, for example, ecclesia is a Greek word, and in the Hellenistic context, that meant assembly, a group of people called out. And so people would be called together to make decisions about things happening in the city or the town or whatever. And so it's not a spiritual word, it's a political term.
Right.
It's so an HOA or like a caucus or city council or something like that, be a group of people pulled together to make decisions about something. So it very much was not a theological term. The other thing that's really interesting to me is that, and many scholars have looked at this, the one that always sticks in my head is Marcus Borg from his book, The Evolution of the Word, where he's pulled the New Testament together in chronological order in which the books were written, not in the order that it was later made into, which is what we currently have. So in that book are some of Paul's letters, which are the earliest documentary evidence we have of the earliest Christian movement. He prefers the translation Christ communities.
Right.
Because he's talking to the groups of people, like especially with Paul, because Paul does a lot of development of this idea of what ecclesia is, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. When it shows up in the Gospels and things like that, those earliest Christ communities, those earliest ecclesia, would have been small groups of people, 10, 15, 20 maybe. And a lot of times people have thought of them as being house churches because people would meet in their homes and gather for their weekly communion meals, which were a full meal at that time. The earliest movement had full meals, not just bread and a juice or a wine. and they would have their weekly religious gatherings, their worship services together. Marcus Borg prefers to think of them as shop churches because a lot of people, like if they had a shop or something, a business, they would rather meet in the shop than a home because they might be slightly larger. So they might be able to get like 20 to 25 people rather than 10 to 15. These were really small groups of people, and they were meeting in people's homes. And if you think about, how many people would have lived in a house back then too, and just the family members, and their animals lived with them, they were in with them too. So it would have been quite a chaotic situation, which also, when I think about it today, and when I think about how some churches, and I certainly grew up in a family where, children are quiet in church and you behave and you don't make a noise and you don't run around and you don't cry in the service and all this. I just think how different those earliest church quote unquote services would have been with, you've got your cow in the next room, you've got your sheep and your donkey, you've got the baby crying, you're making dinner. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff happening. Maybe somebody's knocking on the door because they need something from the shop owner. I mean, it just is a very different feel to what that would have looked like than some of the churches that you walk into where, it's quiet and you're supposed to behave and it's all supposed to be contemplative and beautiful, which is lovely in its own way, but not at all what those earliest Christ communities would have looked like. And so I think there's so much that we have created in our churches today that are not necessarily what they would have been. And so the question today is, do we need church? Do we need to go to church? What is church? What could church be? Should church be? That's one of the first things I think to look at is what does the word church mean? And when we see the word church in our English Bibles, I think, don't you? Most people think that it's like a church building, right?
I think I did, absolutely, way back in the day. I think the more that I've learned about that, and just you painted such a beautiful picture. Also, these houses probably didn't have open floor plans, so you could get all those people. It would have been a teeny little room, I'm sure, that there was their living room. And yeah, so where did all these people go? Then you throw in the persecution before Christianity was even legitimized. These people were hiding, so they couldn't have really gone to one building. They did have to kind of hide a little bit and stay in small pockets.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting. But as you said, yeah, Paul seems to really take that word of assembly, or maybe he should have said Christ communities, whatever, but he took that word and kind of made it his own, meaning that it was a bunch of Christians then gathering and worshiping. I love the idea of them having dinner together. It makes me wonder, when we quote Jesus doing communion and he says, "Do this in remembrance of me," is he talking about just that one moment where they're doing the bread and the wine, or is he talking about have a meal together?
Right.
Like when you sit down and have a meal, talk about me, talk to each other, get to know one another. We're going to walk this out together and do it and remember what I've told you. So that's another kind of, I've heard of lots of churches that have now started to go to that model. I know for me, when I was pastoring, we decided for Easter to just link all of the tables in the sanctuary and put them together in like a horseshoe. So there was never a stop really, as much as we could. And we had a huge Easter brunch. And that was our Easter service, was eating together and celebrating. And I always thought that was kind of fun, just to do something different. Definitely was not the early riser that was going to get up for a sunrise service. I was like, no, I'll have brunch. I need mimosas.
Nothing before 10 a.m., please.
That is not going to happen.
Yeah, not a morning person either.
Yeah. But I think that idea of eating together has always been something that I feel like we have really missed.
Yeah.
And the smaller, like I said, the smaller kind of groups that do that.
Certainly church potlucks and things like that have some of that feel, I think, of probably that coming together around a meal. I think a lot of churches today, in this sheer size of number of people, like there's, they talk about how many people any one person can really get to know, and it's a small number, like 50 people or whatever. And some churches have 50 people, some churches have several hundred, some churches have thousands upon thousands. And just trying to put that early model of these small shop churches, people gathering in someone's home of 10, 15, 20 people maybe, and that model, and then thinking about these huge churches now that have been created, or Catholic churches on Sundays where they have mass after mass after mass after mass because there's so many people in the area going to weekly mass. I mean, that is just a wild thing, and there's no way to know those people,
Right.
And what does the church mean in those situations, and how do you capture or recapture that feeling of those small groups that were the original followers of Jesus? I don't know, it's a tricky thing.
And I like to think, as you said, that if they were in the shops or they met in houses, they probably were neighbors. So they saw each other every single day. And so if somebody would have shown up to the group, to the Christ community, with an issue that they could then discuss, that those then people could then, when they see them the next time, say, how's that going? Do you need any other help? And it is much more of a community. And you kind of see that in Acts when people are bringing all of their stuff, to share with each other.
Yeah.
And that, to me that's a community.
Right.
I also find it interesting, these megachurches, there's always one person in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And that person is over almost everything. Like not that they're over everything, but the buck stops with them. They may hire these people and these people and these people to oversee and try to get smaller and smaller and smaller. But that one person is very much the person.
Mm-hmm.
And I did find in Romans 12:4-5, when they're talking about churches, and Paul is talking about this, that the church, or the community in this case, if we're talking about Paul, it has one body with lots of members, and all of these members are doing different things. There's somebody that serves, there's somebody that this, and that's based on their passions and who they are. And I remember as a pastor, not being really good at certain things, but being pretty good at others. But all of that, at least in the church that I was, because I didn't have a mega church, but even just being over 100 people and the expectations that these people would have on me was like, yeah, I don't do that.
Right.
So then you have to kind of staff your weaknesses. But then it's like, well, what about the people in the church? But then you start to get into these, and again, this is where you build that hierarchy. And I know Paul discusses the hierarchy, but were we supposed to have a hierarchy?
Yeah.
When we talk about all these people and their gifts, do we really have to make sure that, they're good, they're blameless? I love that Paul says that. They need to be blameless. The deacons, they need to be blameless. Their wife needs to be, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, really? Because then that puts on all that pressure. And I remember having to sit people down in ministry because they didn't have their house in order, which who does?
Right. When that happened, what does that mean? Like the kids are acting up, or there's something publicly happening, or what is what
your
what
wife is speaking up and causing a ruckus? That actually happened in my family. My stepmother was, gosh, I feel bad, but she is a very gregarious, eccentric person who loved God. And sometimes she would just say stuff. Well, that didn't go well. And so my dad was then asked to leave because he couldn't control his wife. And he's like, I'm not gonna. Have you met her? Like, yeah.
Wow.
And he didn't want to. That's what he loved about her.
Yeah.
You know? And it's not like she was causing a disturbance in the services, but, you know, she was just too much. She was just too extra.
Yeah.
And so, but they didn't want her to do that. So, you know, oops.
So
He's out.
yeah. And so with that, there's this, I mean, I guess spoken or unspoken expectation of what it means to be a member of the church. And so then, you know, men are supposed to behave this certain way, women are supposed to behave this certain way, and kids are supposed to behave this certain way. And it's all kind of like controlled. And the men, the head of the household, you know, is supposed to have everything under control and be able to just keep everybody, quote unquote, in line.
In line.
That's the method. That's the whole kind of
Because they're in charge.
model, right, of that way of being in the church. And I mean, yeah, good for your dad for not being willing to play into that and be a part of that. That had to be really hurtful.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
For both of them.
Yes.
This is Not Your Pastor's podcast. We ask the questions they told us not to. This is Religious Rejects.
To me, this is what I see today as the church. You know, we're not coming to church broken. We're coming to church whitewashed, if you will.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't get to share what's really going on. I remember going through depression while pastoring, but not feeling that I would ever be able to share that with the church. I should have. And when I finally did, it was great. But I did have a couple people say, well, I wondered what was wrong with you. And I was like, did you ask? But again, that whole pastor thing takes that person out. They don't get to be themselves. They have to be this perfection personified, if you will. And everybody else has to try to follow that. And that, I don't think that is church. I don't think that's what Jesus meant.
So it's like you go to church and you put this mask on, a facade of how everything is just fine and dandy and everything's okay and great, even though your life might be falling apart and all those things. You're struggling with, you know, mental health issues, addiction, maybe you're going bankrupt or your business is struggling or whatever, but people don't, a lot of times when you hear people talk about church, it's like, oh no, I couldn't talk about that at church because it's, although when you think about it, ideally that would be the place you would want to be able to talk about it, right? And yet we have these institutions now, not all churches are this way, but some are, where you can't bring your real life situation. It's not safe to talk about it because there's the judgment that we've talked about before on other episodes, where it's judgment because your house isn't in order or you don't have control over this, that, or the other. Those expectations and those ideas about what church is supposed to be as opposed to what it actually is or what it was back in those earliest days of Jesus's time. You know, and the question is, could we even have church like that anymore? And, you know, we probably couldn't. We live in such a different world now. And we have only glimpses of what those earliest groups would have been like. You know? So we're trying to read into these texts that we have, these scriptures that have been passed on to us. We're trying to read what we can into it, but it's not like they were trying to explain how everything was set up because they knew how it was set up and they didn't have to share those things, you know? And
everybody knew.
It's a different thing. Now, of course, one of the big things that we have to talk about or that we have to address is the sheer number of churches there are and how different they all are and how we have in the Christian community anything but a sense of unity about things. And so, you know, we see in the earliest Pauline letters, we've got people who have disagreements with each other. You can tell that there's strife within a certain community that he's writing to. Think about Corinth. So we know that people being people, doing people-y things, you're going to have disagreements and arguments. And over the centuries, as things developed, those differences led to splits in the Christian movement. And so we had the big split in the 1000s between the Eastern Church and what became the Western Church and the Roman Catholic Church. And then, of course, we had the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. And then now since then, it's just like split after split after split after split. Sometimes I wonder, is it a church if they haven't split yet? You know what I mean? Is that what really makes it an authentic church, that people really disagree with each other so much that they have to split? There's something about human nature. We love to have, I don't know, it's a hard thing to understand, because you'd think if Jesus is asking people to love one another, then we would be able to find a way through our differences. And yet the history of the church shows that we can do anything but that.
Right. And the pressure that puts on whoever's leading that group of people is immense, as you and I both know. Who am I going to please this week? Who am I going to tick off this week? And it can be anything from the air conditioning's on too high to the music's too loud. I don't like that music. I would prefer more contemporary music. I would prefer more traditional music. Like, I personally had 2 different services, one with traditional, one with contemporary, because you get to the point where I just have to please everybody. But why do I have to do this? Because I have to pay the mortgage on the building. And that's when then you start to get into the motives of the church. What should it be? We have a church in Colorado Springs that just bought a massive building in the downtown area that had to have been pretty expensive. And all I can think about is those people's tithes and offerings. Do they know that that's probably what they're going to is just for this building? So all this money that they're giving to this church that should be for taking care of, the pastors, the staffs, and the families, or, reaching more for Jesus. Well, that's not what it's going to go to. It's going to go to the house. And it's like, wow. I mean, how do we think about that sometimes? And again, is that where it starts to get conflated, if you will? This whole idea of church.
Church is the building, and then you have to support the building.
You have to support the building.
And you have to pay the mortgage and the insurance and all of those things. And so then, and I think a lot of people, when they hear the word church, they do think, oh, I'm going to church, which is the building, and it's not the people inside.
Right.
And it's like, no matter how many times you might say it, I think people still think of church as the building and not the people.
Right.
So that's the struggle with having an institution as opposed to a movement, I guess, because those earliest people, I know I always felt I was part, when I was pastoring a church here in Colorado Springs, we had to work hard we were able to pay off the mortgage that we had on our building, which was amazing. It's a burden, making sure that you can get that paid. And then, and I felt envious of Jesus not ever having a building to have to deal with. I was like, why do we have a building? Jesus didn't have a building. Jesus wandered all over the place. And then I was like, well, maybe I don't want to wander quite like Jesus. Jesus didn't really have a home either. So the church people didn't have a home. He didn't have a home. And I guess that's a whole different conversation. But it does then require a certain size of congregation to be able to afford a building in the first place, and then to be able to maintain the building and keep the lights on and the water, coming through the pipes and all those things. It gets complicated really quickly. And I know there are many pastors out there who really feel that burden, even though it's technically, the church as a whole and not on their shoulders. So often it ends up sitting on their shoulders as the called pastor of that church, and it's a real struggle. And so sometimes I think we get lost in that and we forget church is the people. And how do you continue to do the ministry, the outreach, the caring for people, the building up of community, the spiritual growth, helping people learn how to pray, helping people learn how to forgive each other, all of those things that are part of what it means to love God, love your neighbor, which are the relationships. But so often it's like all that other stuff that gets in the way and really prevents that ministry from happening. I don't know, if that just seems really complicated.
Feels like there should be an in-between. There's, obviously in this day and age, as we talked about, a building is very helpful, to be that community place that everybody can go to. Lots of churches will use high schools and all of that, which is a great idea, because now you're not having to deal with the building. You just have to pay rent, and it's a great, community-oriented kind of thing. You still have the issue that if you're going to do that, you still might have over 1,000 people.
Right.
So how then do you create a place that is safe for people to come and be themselves authentically, trust that the people on the stage are also being authentic, and try to recreate that feeling of, doing these things in memory of Jesus and having that. That's, I think, is where the disconnect is today. I do feel like churches probably, I understand the idea of having community, and that is the most important part of the church. I think that is what is supposed to be taken with us forward. How that is played out now, that's where I think we have issues. That's where it's like, and I'm not saying that there's ever going to be a perfect, because people are people-y. And yes, people it up, and then it's going to go bad. But also, should that stop us from trying? Or should that stop us from separating those that feel called to those that should just go? That whole separation. I felt, as a pastor, like I said, it felt that I couldn't be myself. I had to worry about everybody else. In the midst of the fact of I was having pretty much a panic attack, breakdown, all that stuff. And I wasn't allowed to have that. I would have loved to be able to walk into my own church and say, I'm not feeling it. This person's going to take over for a couple of weeks because I'm struggling, and I want to sit there with you and hold your hands while we walk through this. Now, granted, that's on me if I didn't create that, and I get that. But also, would people have stayed? Would I have been able to pay for everything? Would people have seen me as lesser than? This is it's almost like that shame spiral, Like the more I feel like I can't share with others, the more I hide. But if I would have shared it, would people met me there? You know what I mean? It's like, and that's what we do as people when we people it up. We think we have to be perfect for everybody. Because if we aren't, then we're not going to be as trustworthy, which is interesting because you're probably already lying in order to be perfect. So you're not trustworthy.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway.
So I have a question for you. So since you left being a pastor, have you attended a church regularly?
No.
What is that about? Like, what's been going on at that? Like, what's been part of that process for you?
Well, for me, I think I just needed to figure out who I was. Number one. But it doesn't mean I didn't have community. And I think that, again, is where that's what brought me kind of back around to, I don't know if I ever want to go back to church again in that way. As you know, I I do have a couple communities that meet in my house once a week. And it's just about, less than 10 people per community. And we go through the Gospels and see them in a different way. But what I love about it is that I get to be my full self when I walk in. And I know that when I mess up, especially, and this happened very recently where I messed up in one of the groups. I said something I should never have said. And I was called out on it, which I love. First of all, that somebody felt safe enough to look at me and say, no. And I was like, you are right. And the best part was I knew it too. The moment I said it, the moment it was out of my mouth, I'm like, ooh, I'm gonna have to apologize for that later. Thankfully, later wasn't that long because this person says, hey, that's not what we do here, is it? You've trained us that we don't do this. And to be fair, I don't train anybody. I mean, it's just that these are the guidelines and we're all agreeing to them, right? Right. So the fact that even though I'm quote unquote the leader, which I don't necessarily feel, like that's the very difference between when I was pastoring and doing this. I feel like I'm part of the group, but yes, it's in my house. And yes, technically I'm the one that's supposed to say, oh no, you can't do that. But so it was so great that somebody said to me, no, you can't do that. I was like, yes, but also I am so sorry.
Yeah.
That hurt you. I am so sorry.
Yeah.
And it was a beautiful moment for everybody. One, for the person that called me out, because they were like, the last time I called somebody out, they went crazy on me and it scared me and I have not said anything. We got to talk about it later. And I loved that, it was almost like that was the best mess up I could have ever done because it allowed this person to say, let me see if she really is who she says she is. You shouldn't have said that. And I was like, you're 100% right. I shouldn't have said that. And I'm going to tell the whole group that I messed up. And no excuses, no nothing like, oh, I was tired. No, nothing. I just said, I fucked up, and that's just the way it is because I'm gonna.
Yeah.
And to watch that person just grow in the confidence of like, oh my God, I called you out and you did it. And you didn't make me feel like I was the bad guy. You didn't gaslight me because this person was really beaten up in the past. And it was just so good because this is what it's healthy. And it's like, it goes back to that whole when Jesus talks about, take it to the assembly. Well, first, this person took it to me.
Yeah.
And I said, yep. And then I took it to the assembly because I did it in front of the assembly. And I wanted to make sure that they knew that I was wrong. And it was so great because then we all got to talk about it.
Yeah. And then it's over.
It's over.
It's done and it doesn't fester. It doesn't become this big drama where it's all like, well, did you see what Christine did and blah, blah, blah last week, la, 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 and she, blah, blah, and that's, I think, the struggle is living out some of these things that are in our scriptures.
Yeah.
And actually doing them and embodying them, even though it can be hard because we have to accept when we've done something that we as a group have said we wouldn't do or whatever. And unfortunately, I think that's a place where I think a lot of people are struggling with their institutional churches because the leadership hasn't been as transparent about things, hasn't been as clear about things, hasn't taken responsibility for things that the institution has done. When you think about these sex abuse scandals and some of the sexual harassment scandals that we're seeing in some of these mega churches that are in the news, more often than not, the institution is trying to protect itself.
Yeah.
And so doesn't share what they know, doesn't share the truth of what happened. And maybe in some situations, it seems like there has been some attempt at taking responsibility, but it's after a long time and lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. And it's sort of like, is that really what the whole thing is supposed to be about? If a leader or someone who is part of the church does something wrong, I mean, ideally, people can address it and say, hey, this happened. The person can say, I'm sorry, and, find a way to move forward. But today, I think a lot of people don't trust leaders in organizations. They don't trust the institutions themselves because for too long, it's been about preserving the institution's power and money and leadership rather than actually acknowledging harm that has been done to people in the churches. And there's a whole lot of people who will never walk through another church door because of some of the harm and abuse that they've gone through. And that's heart-wrenching. And to me, it's the antithesis of what church is meant to be about. It's not a place to be harmed. It's not a place to be abused by leadership or by power. And, I wonder sometimes how much hierarchy really should be in our churches, in our organizations.
Yes.
Because it seems like the more hierarchy in organizations that we have, the more harm that can ultimately be perpetrated. I don't know. It's a tricky time, I think, and people are suspicious and cynical about leadership in organizations as they
should
have
be.
every right to be, with all of the things that have come out about sexual abuse and harm and abuse of power in some of these organizations, for sure. So
one of the things that I love about the communities that I run now is that there's a phrase that gets used every time we meet, and it's companions who walk alongside. And so even though I might be the facilitator, the leader, I'm still a companion who gets to walk alongside with everybody else. And I love that concept because then it does allow you to be me, or it does allow me to be myself and to be completely honest, to mess up. And it's going to be okay because we're all going to be there. I got a text from somebody after I had apologized, and I apologized in the text immediately after the meeting and then in person at the meeting. But in between that time, one person wrote that said, "Thank you, Christine, for being both human and divine." And I was like, wait, what? Like, that was so beautiful that somebody could still, after me doing what I'd done, still see me as, and it's okay. You are both human and divine, and that is okay. And we walk this road together. And someday that person's going to be a little bit more human than divine, and we're going to be there for that person because they were there for me. Do you know what I mean? And to me, that's the whole idea of the church. That's my idea of what it meant to be a community, to walk with each other, to figure it out. I mean, we talk a lot in the evangelical churches about being accountable to each other. And that has turned into, I don't know, something kind of icky where, and I don't know if you had this, but like we were always encouraged to have an accountability partner. But that just meant you were giving somebody permission to call you out on all your shit, which is fine, I guess. But to me, there has to be a relationship. Do you know what I mean? It's one thing for me to be honest with this group and this person to call me out on my shit because of the group guidelines that we had. But it's another thing for somebody to walk up to me and go, "You watch Love Island?" I'm like, "Uh-huh." You shouldn't watch Love Island. Don't care. Love it. You know what I mean? Like, you don't know me, but you're just going to work on all this excess stuff. Should you really be wearing that shirt? It's a little revealing. I mean, that's what accountability partners ended up being. Instead of like this person or this group of people that could all say, "Hey, Kristen, you kind of crossed the line here based on these guidelines that we all have as a group." And I could say, "You know what? I did. You're right. I'm sorry."
So it's like there's this line between like what's acceptable or not, and they're often cultural sorts of things, probably. And it's beyond, it sounds like it's beyond accountability. It's really into a judgment.
Yeah.
Like in that judgment zone. And so I think it's really easy for churches, because they are larger groups of people, to get into that place of judging each other as the assembly of people together, called together by God, even if we're not acting in a Christ-like way all the time. When we can become really judgmental of each other. And I think that's, again, I think that's one of those struggles that is a very real and human struggle that every community has to grapple with. How do we show up as our true selves? How do we show what's really going on in our lives? And then allow other people to do that as well, and not judge them for it. I think that's it's a rare community that can manage that balance of, helping people grow and change, and also making space for the messiness in the midst of it. And being able to say, I'm sorry when things happen. It's really, it's a lot of things. And it's a lot of things to have to kind of hold all together. And there's a lot going on with that. I think Paul, we were talking about this, Paul in his letters, he's addressing the real life, lived experiences of these Christ communities in these cities and towns that he'd visited. So Paul's writing these letters, trying to advise them and help them through the problems that they're facing. And some of the things he says, don't sue one another. Like, work it out amongst yourselves. Don't take it to the courts, things like that. And he does talk about how that we are the body of Christ, and that each of us have different roles and callings, and they're all important, and so the one who can prophesy, that's important, but the one who can teach, that's also important. The one who can serve, that's also important. And so there is a very egalitarian idea at the heart of that vision of being the body of Christ that Paul has. And yet that's different from a lot of church situations where there's definitely a hierarchy in, there's the pastor, then you have some of the other leaders, and maybe the band leader, maybe whatever, moderator of the board, or the board of directors, or whoever the organization's leadership council is. So you definitely have these hierarchies, and maybe that's human nature. I don't know. Maybe it's just what happens when we have to organize ourselves
and then bring money into it.
Well, yeah.
You know what I mean? To me, that's where we go a little, to me, that's what messes it up. If I'm going to lose my job as a ministry leader, a worship leader, as a children's director, as a youth director, because somebody sees sin in my life, then I'm going to have to hide that sin, because this salary is what is helping my family.
Right.
And that's where that's where it gets dangerous to me. And
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was really clear back in the 30s. He did not think that pastors should be paid by the local church, that when you have that fiscal responsibility to each other between the church congregation and a pastor, when you have that, it really can corrupt, I guess, the relationship, is what he saw.
I think that's perfect. It corrupts the relationship, because then then I don't get to be my 100% authentic self, because I can't tell you I'm struggling with something, because if you see that I'm struggling with something, then you're going to have to take me out of ministry. Now, how am I going to pay for my house? Do you know what I mean? Like, it corrupts that relationship. And I think that's my biggest issue with churches today. And I say this full well knowing that, yes, I was paid. I wasn't paid much.
Yeah.
And I did live in a parsonage, so technically I didn't have to pay a mortgage, but, and I remember when I was like, it's time to go, I knew I was going to have to give all that up and figure out how to take care of myself in other ways. But also that was the best thing I ever did. Because then I was free from the constraints that a church put on me. And I was able to share whatever I wanted to share, however I wanted to share it, and just be real with it. Just to be real. This is not about whether or not, I need to take a bigger offering this week. That's the other thing too. Oh my gosh. When the church isn't doing well, and then your church treasurer comes and says, "Can you do another tithing message?" Oh, for the love. No. Like, if they don't know it by now, and I hated that, just asking for more money,
Yeah.
because people aren't tithing.
There's a lot of pressure on that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Were you ever a part of a church where there was a minimum expectation of tithing, and if you did not meet it, like you would have to meet with the leaders to show like what you were making and to make sure that you were actually tithing, giving 10% of your income to the church or whatever? There are churches who do that where they
with their members.
with their members.
Oh no.
No, okay.
No, I never had to do that. But there's the members that have to give to the church, and then the church, if you're in a denomination, has to then tithe 10% to the denomination. Now, we always did that, but then there wasn't a lot left. The great thing about, at least for me, when I got to pastor and I was in charge as much as I could be, I was able to help churches that didn't have buildings. And so we had 3 churches meeting in our one building. We had an art therapist. We had a food pantry run by one of the churches. So there was a whole bunch of us. And then we had a chess club. The state chess kids would come and get ready for states and championships. And I got to just serve them. We made them food and stuff. And it was, that was fun. But when you're in a denomination and they give you your monthly sheet and they want to know how many people you had in your church and how much money did you make in your church, that didn't seem to translate well when it got to wherever it was going in the headquarters. They would look at it and go, "This church is never going to make it." So when they did ask me to leave my building because what I was doing wasn't sustainable, even though but look at all these people in the community that I'm helping. Isn't that what it's supposed to be about? Aren't I supposed to be, serving the community? And no, I apparently was supposed to be making money. So I was like, oh, well, I didn't even see that one coming.
Right.
I was just worried about, and all of our bills were paid. That was the miracle. Like, we paid off all our bills. Everything was done every month. But we weren't sustainable. And it's like, okay, but we have 3 churches meeting. Like, think of all of this that is happening. And we were in a neighborhood. So it was great,
Streaming from the heart of the Rockies, this is Religious Rejects. Watch, listen, and join the discussion at religiousrejects.com.
If you could create a dream church, what would it look like?
So creating a dream church, if I could create a dream church, it's such a big question, because what we always bump up against is human nature and who we become in groups and the ways that we as humans function together, and we don't get along and all of that. A lot of what I focused on in my last church was focusing on healthy communication and healthy relationship building and helping people address things when they came up with each other so that they wouldn't fester and just get, kind of cut into the core of the church. There's nothing that will tear apart the fabric of a community faster than arguments and fights and disagreements. And so a lot of what I would focus on is, helping all of us, because it's a practice, I think. It's not anything you can ever perfect. The practice of dealing directly with each other and addressing things when they come up, being able to say, "Hey, this hurt my feelings," bringing it to someone and then having them say, "Hey, that's not what I meant. and I acknowledge that that affected you in that way, and I'm sorry, And they sound basic, but they're so hard for us to do in real life. Our ego gets in the way. We're more self-righteous or somehow better than other people. I don't know. Sometimes we just have a hard time being able to say, I'm sorry, or that we can acknowledge that we did something wrong. I have a hard time being able to identify a dream church scenario simply because every church I've ever been a part of, the history of who that church has been is so particular to that group of people and is still being lived out in the current community of people, even if they weren't there when the church was founded or whatever. And so it's, you can't just separate whatever group of people have come together to build a congregation. It's like it's part of a larger movement. It's part of the people who came before, and these things live on in these communities, even if it happened 25, 30 years ago. Sometimes those hurts and disagreements continue to live on in the life of the community. And so I don't know. I'm not sure if I could say what a dream church is. I think a dream church is the church that is able to meet together in this day and age as a group of people, be able to be in the same room together. Maybe it's a very low bar. Be in the same room together, be able to enjoy each other, and actually, where people are continuing to take that next step in their spiritual journey. So often it seems like church has gotten caught up in, being seen or going somewhere, and people forget about that spiritual growth and their own journeys that they're supposed to be on. And, how do I continue to learn how to trust God more? How do I continue to grow in my prayer life? All these kinds of things. And far too often, it seems like church itself is focused on everything but that sort of thing.
Right.
So I don't know, maybe it's just a really low bar. The dream church today is the kind that can actually meet together, that is surviving in a post-pandemic world in a country like the United States that is, losing its churches by the day, and fewer people are actually going to church than ever before. So maybe that's what a dream church is today. I don't know.
Thanks for tuning in. Up next, will the rejects keep, rethink, or reject today's topic? Stay with us.
So what do you keep, rethink, or reject about church?
I would definitely keep the idea of community and companions to walk alongside with. I think that's very important. And the authenticity of what it was meant to be. I definitely rethink the whole pastors getting paid. I always had a hard time with it anyway. So I definitely want to rethink that, because I do feel like that just distorts it. Maybe I'm not even rethinking that. Maybe I'm rejecting that one. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and reject that one. I remember Brian McLaren in his book, Do I Stay Christian?, discussing about Christianity being a failed religion based on the fact that there was no transformation. And to me, that's kind of the whole point. Like, if we're not transforming, if there's nothing real about it, if there's no place for somebody to come and safely let their burdens go and then be built back up, then I definitely reject all of that, because I think that's the whole point. That's what Jesus wanted, was to set people free. And if we are supposed to be people creating Christ communities, these communities should be setting people free, not keeping them in bondage and in shame and a hamster wheel.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what it feels like. So I reject the hamster wheel.
Okay.
Yeah.
I definitely reject the idea that church is a building, that church. I embrace this idea of Christ communities, that it's the group of people gathering. I think the institutional pieces of so much of our denominations and our church structures today, it just kind of drains the life out of our actual communities. And the bigger an organization gets, I think the further away from that individual spiritual transformation they often get. So it's a strange thing to say, but I think that institutional hierarchy I really struggle with, and I'm definitely rethinking that. I will keep the idea that church is an assembly of people. It's a gathering of people. And I love that idea of companions on a journey. That's what it's all about. That's beautiful. And that we are here to be transformed. And we are in a world that needs transformation. I'm all for those parts of it, and I'm ready to leave other parts of it all behind.
Agreed. Your picture when you talked about the animals and the people and the kids, that's loud and it's messy.
Yeah, and smelly.
And smelly. And I think that's probably what church is supposed to be. Loud, messy, and smelly. Yeah. With wine.
Yeah. And good food.
Yes. Exactly.
I love that. Yeah. That sounds like a great place. I'd be there.
I would too. All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We will see you next time.